And so one of the most mysterious things about this general rubric of quantum we're using is that reality actually changes shape based on the way we look at it. And maybe this is in relationship to the wave particle duality of light. And so my general question here is, you referred earlier to this logical construct of the operating system sitting on top of the Apple computer. And there's been some theory put forth. I'm reflecting here on the book, The Case Against Reality by Hoffman, where he's positing that consciousness is like an interface. Like what we think is real, like we're observing objective reality, we're actually seeing some biological interface. So is it possible that we are seeing some biologically generated logical construct of reality versus reality itself when we're performing these observations?
Well, boy, so you're dragging this guy Hoffman in, and I've heard him on a few podcasts, and he and I have never run into each other. He comes out of a sort of a weird school, one of the UCs. I think it's UC Riverside or Irvine. I can't remember which. Maybe there's a guy named Duncan Luce. Can't remember exactly. But they get pretty crazily mathematical and psychological out there. And the question is always, are they bullshitting or are they on to something? Mm-hmm. You can definitely say certain things that people find confusing in this area that are easy. So one of which is, for example, does the color red really exist? A wavelength exists that our brain, our mind processes as red. We experience it as red. Mm-hmm. But that's the proximate sensation, and the ultimate stimulus is the photon that hits the retina. Mm-hmm. Right? So the retina gets hit by a photon of a particular nature, and it sends a signal, and the brain says, let's conjure up some of that redness and feed it to the visual cortex, or maybe it produces it in the visual cortex. That's a good example of something where the subjective impression isn't really in the outside world. It's something that we used to tag it. Then you have questions like the default mode network that's popular in psychedelic discussions. Mm-hmm. Is the principal feature of the mind or the brain that it has to screen out almost all of reality. You could certainly see this, for example, in your retina, since we're talking about that with the fovea versus the peripheral area. Your brain probably couldn't handle a highly resolved picture. So it says, well, we're going to have a ton of receptors in the fovea, and then we'll have very gross stuff in the periphery, so it can alert you that you should put your fovea on a new topic, but we're not going to spend the computational power to have you focusing on things that are probably irrelevant. So it's probably more important that you not look at the things in your peripheral vision than that you do look at me while we're having this Zoom call.
Is the fovea the point of focus?
Yeah, effectively.
Okay.
I mean, it's the point of it. It's the focus of attention, because the word focus is overloaded, maybe more than one thing, right? You can have an eye that isn't well focused, but is focusing on something in terms of its attention. And that's a good example of the fact that you don't want all the information. I mean, can you imagine if God was keeping track of every single particle in the universe? What a waste of God's time. Whether or not God exists, it's just a thought experiment. So mostly you want things to run on their own, and you have a tiny amount of attention, and you want to be able to place it in places that matter.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. I had this conversation with a cognitive scientist, Vervaeke, and he was saying that, I don't know if this is the purpose of consciousness or a purpose of consciousness, but was to be able to place that fovea or that point of attention on things that aren't necessarily understood, that are maybe novel, I guess.
Right.
But to the ultimate
automate
aim,
everything.
Yeah, exactly. To automate. So you want to embed that knowledge in your procedural knowing, so that you're almost freeing your consciousness up to focus on other novel phenomenon. And I couldn't help but notice the connection here to something like, there's that old Alfred North Whitehead quote that I'll roughly paraphrase, but he says, it's conventional wisdom that we should think before acting, but civilization advances by the opposite. The more important operations we can carry out without thinking about them, the more civilized we become, something like that. So it's as if we're trying to economize our action, right? Using the fovea to deal with novel circumstances, but then embedded procedural knowledge to deal with familiar situations.
Well, what's your pancreas doing right now, Robert?
Something important, I'm sure.
You have no idea.
Yeah.
You're the owner of some incredibly important machine. You have no idea what it does or how it works.
Yeah.
So that's an example of something that's been automated. There's a sort of more general, I mean, I'm just riffing with you, but there's a more general version of this that says the purpose of consciousness from an evolutionary perspective may be the direction of non-smooth muscle when to contract. It's like a very weird thing to unpack. Like, consciousness is about non-smooth muscle. What the F? The claim is that the smooth muscle works on its own. You don't have access to it.
Yeah.
The only thing that the consciousness can control is the muscles that can be stimulated to like, do me a favor. Let's both snap our fingers on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So in that situation, our consciousness was able to direct our fingers to undertake an action.
Uh-huh.
Right? Whereas if you tried to tell your body to do peristalsis, it wouldn't know what to do in terms of moving food along your intestines or whatever. And that's an argument that consciousness can't be for anything that it can't direct. And all it can direct is non-smooth muscle, whether it's a smile, a wiggling of the ears, moving your eyes subtly. There's this interesting scene in The Godfather where Luca Brasi is being murdered. And just before he's murdered, he wants to light a cigarette. He's been offered a drink. And Philip Tattaglia is looking at Luca Brasi getting a cigarette lit. And almost imperceptibly, he just looks up ever so slightly when he sees that Luca is not looking at him, but he's looking at the cigarette to see whether the guy who's behind him is in place to garrote him with some piano wire. And you're just thinking, like, that tiny little move is the only clue Luca Brasi has that he's about to be murdered, and he misses it because Tattaglia is directing his eye to do something ever so slightly. Mm-hmm. That was just an example of a tiny non-smooth muscle that got moved that had serious consequences.